our next thing here today is about how research points to the effectiveness of conflict resolution skills in virtual teams. And the questions that were asked in the study are, what is the relationship between cultural heterogeneity and task conflict? And then do conflict resolution skills moderate this relationship? And they asked the same question about emotional conflict, which is relational conflict in the study. And so,
what's that? No, is that background in your?
Is
it
what?
People talking in the background of your thing, or is that?
That might be mine. Yeah.
Oh, okay. There's people back. Okay.
Gotcha. Is it too? Can you hear me fine?
I was just curious. Yeah, if it was. I was curious.
Is it too distracting, or is it?
Is that your fam?
No, the Wi-Fi in most of the town that I'm in, is down almost everywhere.
Oh wow!
So I'm at a cafe outside right now with some people. Yeah. So anyways, so these are the kind of the questions that we're looking at, and the methods that were used for this were there was these 137 participants that were recruited, and they were required to have worked virtually for at least 6 months prior to being distributed a survey that measured workplace interpersonal conflict, relational conflict, task conflict, and conflict resolution skills. And then additionally, the author measured cultural heterogeneity, interdependence, and team effectiveness. What they found here is that really, in terms of the questions they asked, there wasn't a lot of significance. So there was no significant relationship between cultural heterogeneity and task conflict, which doesn't support past research findings, which is interesting. And then additionally, conflict resolution skills were not a significant moderator of this relationship. And similarly, cultural heterogeneity was not a significant predictor of emotional or relational conflict. However, they did find that conflict resolution skills were a significant predictor of emotional conflict, but were not a moderator of the non-significant relationship between cultural heterogeneity and emotional conflict. And this kind of suggests how effective conflict resolution skills can be in relational conflict specifically. The author did find a significant relationship between interdependence and task conflict, relational conflict, and team effectiveness, suggesting that interdependence can be constructive or destructive depending on the level of task and relational conflict there. And then conflict resolution skills were also found to have a significant negative relationship with relational conflict, which validated previous studies that show relational conflict can inhibit team effectiveness. Conflict resolution skills were also positively related to effectiveness, demonstrating the importance of utilizing these skills among specifically virtual teams. And so the author suggested that, in terms of the key takeaway, the author suggested that due to the positive relationship between conflict resolution skills and effectiveness, training on conflict resolution could be implemented for successful teamwork of these culturally heterogeneous virtual teams. And so organizations should also aim to keep relational conflict low among these virtual teams to avoid costly destructive conflict. And again, conflict resolution skills, conflict resolution training can be utilized kind of within virtual teams even to do this. And so a lot of this study kind of adds to the literature because there's not as many studies looking at specifically within virtual teams, do conflict resolution skills really make a difference? And this study kind of shows that yes, they do in terms of team effectiveness.
So did they, so this is, I mean, obviously this is good support for what we do. Do they talk about the types of conflict resolution skills or the type of conflict resolution training? Were they just asking, have you been trained in this before? Is that what they were asking, or did they actually implement some sort of training?
Yeah, it was just asking. There wasn't any sort of experimental. Yeah.
So yeah, so that's I mean, to me, like the big question from this is like, which skill, like it's because it depends on, do you have a good skills, a training workshop? Do you have a good teacher? Do you have a good, what are the skills that are being trained?
Which when I think about companies and organizations out there, I go towards HR. And so for companies to train have their HR personnel or departments, if there's multiple, be trained in conflict resolution is key. So I think there's just so many HR professionals out there that don't have any training in this or background in conflict.
Yeah, let alone the rest of the staff. They don't like, there's so many cultures that are conflict avoidant because they don't know how to be uncomfortable and talk about things and be assertive. So wait, so Noah, the author found a significant relationship between interdependence and task conflict. So the relationship, was it, okay, so it was both negative and positive depending on the level of the conflict, is that?
Right, yeah, depending on how, yeah, I guess, yeah, both task and relational conflict. Or whatever the level was, that's how it.
Either constructive depending on the level of task and relational conflict. So like, because what I would think is if they're more interdependent, then task conflict kind of goes down, and more interdependence can lead to lower conflict, but what this is saying that it also can lead to higher conflict depending on
lower interdependence. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I mean, I guess it depends on how the interdependence is handled. Is it? Because if you're completely independent, then you don't have any task conflict. But if you have a functional interdependence, then you should also have a lower task conflict.
Right. I think that what they have here is kind of in line with that, and I'm not sure exactly how. They didn't really go into detail on how both of those are break down. It was more so just that there's a significant relationship, and yeah. So I would think it would be in line with what you just said.
Will you put I just want to take a look at. Do you have a link to this study by chance? Or?
Yeah. I'll put it.
Because they probably have some statistics in there that you could kind of see where the threshold is of.
But I would also think that, I mean, the more interdependent you are, the more opportunity there is for conflict. Because the more you're communicating, the more you're having to work together and collaborate. So then that does give more opportunity, more room to have, whether it's task related or emotional conflict.
Yeah, so like the more you have to depend on each other like the more independent, you don't have any task conflict because you're just independent, but the more you have to depend on each other, there's a lot of opportunity for conflict. But if you have like a function, like a good functional interdependence, then yeah. So there's relationship independent.
But then also, I mean, even with a functional interdependence, and even with the conflict, it can still be positive if it's task related, because I mean that can lead to more creativity and finding other ways to get things done, and ultimately better communication. So, and it doesn't necessarily say that it, well, let me see, does it say that it's negative or destructive? Yeah, it says it can be. It could be either constructive or destructive.
Yeah, I'm looking at the
which
paper.
highlights why the takeaway is that training is effective and relevant in order to lean more towards the constructive way of managing conflict versus the destructive.
Workplace, kind of 6-item workplace interpersonal conflict scales. I mean, I'm just looking at the paper here. Culture hedge. Okay, so they did a correlation. Task conflict. Here, I'll show you what I'm looking at. Oh, here, you want to, here, let me share my screen so we can look at the statistics. Is it, okay, here we go. Yeah. All right, so let's see. So they did Pearson correlation, so emotional conflict. Okay, so they did this correlation with emotional conflict, task conflict. Let's see, so correlation is the one. Okay, so significant. So task conflict and emotional conflict were significant.
I mean, it's just saying that there's a correlation, right? That when there is, which, I mean, practically speaking, it makes sense. Tony said, if you're dependent on other departments or other colleagues to get your jobs done, then there might be more room for both task and relational conflict. But also, I mean, also if you're not interdependent and you're independent, you don't know if something goes wrong. It could be a a more severe, more destructive conflict because there's no communication. So I mean, to me, practically speaking, it makes sense, and that's kind of why this study is highlighting training, right? And people just being open to managing and dealing with conflict in more creative ways. I think.
Yeah.
Practically speaking, it makes sense. Not sure what all these numbers mean. So that's just, I'm just trying to kind of have the practical lens here.
Yeah. So, let's look at the, I mean, I think this is good to like kind of look at. I mean, and if you guys are interested in this, in terms of like looking at research studies and knowing what kind of numbers to look at, I'm just like, okay, so these are just basically what's correlating with each other. And so you can see here, these stars mean that it's correlating at a significant value, statistically significant, which means that task conflict is correlating with emotional conflict, because emotional conflict is number one. So task and emotional, there's a correlation there. So that means they're positively correlated. Conflict resolution skills, there's also a correlation. It might be at 0.005. I don't know what the 1 star means, but it might be a point, but it's a negative correlation. So that means emotional conflict is negatively correlated with conflict resolution skills. So that makes sense. And then if you go down to these other hypotheses, I'm not going to like, let's not read all through that, but what we're looking at here is, so they're measuring correlations with task conflict. They're measuring the correlation between task conflict and heterogeneity, conflict resolution skills, and the interaction between the two. And I think the most important is the p-value right here, which is the significance. That's statistically significant. So it has to be below 0.05. There's none of these correlations are below 0.05, so that means that there's no correlation with this. So if we go down to here and we look at the p-value here, again, this is the constant, so we don't have to look at that, but this is the above p of, because this one is lower than p05, so it means it's significant. So that means that conflict resolution skills and relational conflict have a significant correlation. It's a negative correlation, negative 4.57. So again, that makes sense. Conflict resolution skills negatively correlated. Again, here is the p-values. They're looking at interdependence, task conflict resolution skills. Okay, well, let me see here. Significantly between interdependent lower models, community model. Okay. Got it. So if there's some interaction. Okay, so again, so P is all greater than P05. This one is lower, so that means significant. So interdependence centered. So what I think this means is they're measuring all 3 of these in a regression, which means that they're measuring it as a correlation. So interdependence, task conflict resolution skills. Okay, so basically interdependence, task conflict, and conflict resolution skills have some sort of have some significant correlation. 0.288. Okay, yeah. So again, it's not telling you which way it's going. Authorization is this. I think I'd have to read into this more to even understand it. Here are the p-values. So these are p-values. These are significant. Interdependence and effectiveness are sort of correlated with relational conflict and conflict resolution skills. Their effectiveness is negatively correlated. And wait, no, that's and then interdependence. Okay, P is less than 0.05. Relational conflict, task conflict, and conflict resolution skills. Okay, so it's kind of saying the same thing that Noah was saying, but I can't tell which direction it's. I mean, it doesn't seem. I can't tell which direction it's going. I have to read into it a little bit. But so they didn't find any correlation with heterogeneity, which I mean, and that's just like they're just asking people how diverse do you think your culture is, essentially, and I think that usually doesn't tell us much, because like diversity can be done good and it can be done badly, right? So like is it diverse, but is it also inclusive? You know, is it equitable? Like those things also need to be measured and inclusive. We should take one of these sessions and just like dive into one paper and just kind of look at the statistics and just kind of like try to understand.
I would be up for that. It'd be good learning point, I feel like.